New York City has a painful lesson that South Africa must heed, especially before the municipal elections. Let's get into it. So at the time of recording, the New York City mayoral election is underway, with early voting already in progress. Now, what's particularly alarming is that according to the election polls, the most radical, underqualified candidate is actually winning the race. But before we get into it, could I please remind everyone to subscribe to the channel? It's entirely free, and all you have to do is click on that subscribe button in the bottom left corner of this video. Now let's get into this fiasco. So the race for New York mayor consists of 3 candidates. The first one, named Curtis Sliwa, is the Republican candidate. Now, Curtis has had quite a long career, but what he's probably most famous for is being the founder and CEO of the Guardian Angels. Now, the Guardian Angels are a non-profit crime prevention organization, an NGO, and they originated in New York City in 1977. So Sliwa decided to found the group, originally called the Magnificent 13, to patrol the Bronx and the New York City subway overnight. The reason for this was because the city was experiencing such surging crime that he decided that the time had come for vigilantes to step in and assist the police in crime prevention. And so in their red berets and unmistakable jackets, the Guardian Angels would patrol the dangerous streets of the Bronx and the New York Underground in order to ensure that people felt safe during their travels while dissuading criminal opportunists from harming others. Now, you might not love all of Sliwa's initiatives, but this certainly is proof that he's somebody who is highly dedicated to New York City and views the enormous security crisis in the city with utmost importance. Next up is Andrew Cuomo, who on paper is probably the most qualified candidate for the role. Cuomo is most famous for being the governor of New York State, a role that he held from 2011 until 2021. Now, of course, as governor, he has a great understanding of how the state operates as well as its finances, and he had an extensive relationship with New York City. Furthermore, when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, Andrew was actually the United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And of course, this is a very important role and relevant to New York City because rent, the management of space, and other developmental issues fall right under the portfolio of housing and urban development. And so Cuomo is really the ideal candidate to handle such issues. We then have Zoran Mamdani. So at 34 years old, Mamdani was born in Uganda, immigrated to the United States, and has never really held down a job. You see, he became a political activist and campaigner during his early adulthood and was then elected to the New York State Assembly in 2021. What's really interesting is that he ran again in 2022 and 2024 and was re-elected without opposition. There was just nobody to challenge him. So he definitely is the most underqualified candidate. What's also important to note is that whereas Sliwa and Cuomo are moderates, sure, Sliwa's more conservative, Cuomo's more centrist/liberal, Mamdani is the most radical of the lot. He's a self-proclaimed democratic socialist with some pretty extreme policies, which we'll get into a little later. But before then, what we need to actually check out is the political polling. So an enormous amount of polling has been done ahead of the New York City election, but what's probably the most alarming poll is this by Atlas Intel. The reason why I'm specifically highlighting this poll is because Atlas Intel has proven to be one of the most accurate pollsters, especially when predicting the outcome of presidential elections, such as when Trump was elected president last year. So if we take a look at this poll, we see that Mamdani is leading the pack with 40.6% of the vote. He's followed by Cuomo at 34%. So Mamdani has a 6.6% lead over Cuomo. And then we see Curtis Sliwa trailing in third with 24.1%. So now that we've seen the data, let's discuss why Mamdani's lead is so alarming. So as I mentioned, he considers himself a democratic socialist. And while people might think that socialism can be valid in certain instances, his policies are downright outrageous. On one hand, he loves to advocate for free stuff. This guy has advocated for free buses in New York City. He then talks about having free daycare. I'm not sure who's supposed to fit the bill for that. I'm assuming it would be the taxpayers. And he also talks about having publicly owned grocery stores. And sure, it might sound like a good idea. He says that he's going to do so to lower prices. How exactly is this going to be implemented? Are the government officials going to somehow set up brand new grocery stores? Or are they somehow going to take over pre-existing stores who are owned by other people? Nobody seems to quite know how this is going to work. And so in actual fact, there are two issues at play here that South Africa needs to learn from. On one hand, New York City voters seem to be voting with their hearts rather than their heads. They hear about free stuff and reduced prices, and sure, I get it. New York City is a very expensive place, and the cost of living is a massive issue. But they're voting for policies that just have no practical implementation. The second issue, which is probably even more alarming, is that they don't seem to understand what they're actually voting for. You see, Mamdani has taken a very critical stance in the Middle East conflict, consistently supporting the Palestinians and going against Israel. While many of the pro-Gaza or pro-Palestinian New Yorkers have decided to rally to Mamdani's side, what they're not realizing is that Mamdani has absolutely no impact on the conflict. In fact, he has no impact on US foreign policy, because that is a competency that lies with the executive branch of the federal government. That is led by President Trump and his cabinet. We then also see how he loves to make outrageous campaign promises. So in this article here, we see that Mamdani pledged to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, that's the Israeli prime minister, in New York City, and he claims that he's doing so due to the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant on Netanyahu. But what he doesn't seem to understand is that, first of all, he has no authority to do so. He is the mayor. He's not part of the federal government. And second of all, the US has no obligation to do so because the US is actually not a member of the ICC. And so this ICC warrant does not apply to the United States. And so this promise that he's making is absolute nonsense. He has no authority to even enact it, and yet people are getting worked up and saying they're going to vote for him because of empty campaign promises such as this. You know, there was even an interesting New York Times article I read about people who've already done their early voting. One couple said that because they're a gay couple, they decided to vote for Mamdani because of his pro-LGBT stance. But guess what? Having a pro-LGBT stance has nothing to do with running a city, first of all. Second of all, people like Cuomo are also pro-LGBT. So what is their point? And so there are two massive problems that South African voters need to take note of here. First of all, when it comes to next year's municipal elections, South Africans must not fall into the trap of not realizing what issues are of a national importance and so should be discussed in a general election, and what actually applies to municipal elections, because the issues are different. Second of all, they really need to think with their heads. You see, voters need to understand that not every campaign promise they hear is necessarily something that can be practically implemented. People need to take note of this. And so now that we've discussed this absolute circus going on in New York, it's time to ask ourselves, well, in South Africa, what exactly is it that we are voting for? So in municipal elections, every voter receives two ballots. The first ballot is the ward ballot. The second one is the PR ballot, which stands for proportional representation. On the ward ballot, you are voting for the councillor that you want to represent your ward. So just to break it down, a ward is generally comprised of a few different suburbs or areas within a municipality. And of course, when you add up all of the wards together, that makes up the entire municipality. And so when you vote for your ward councillor, you're actually voting for the person that will be in charge of ensuring that things in your area work. Now, these could be a variety of service delivery issues. So, for example, if there's a water outage or a water leak, or perhaps refuse removal hasn't taken place on time, maybe you're driving and you see a fresh pothole. These are all things that you would want to discuss with your ward councillor, and then it is the ward councillor's responsibility to escalate the issue to council in order to get it resolved. And so when you vote on your ward ballot, you need to look at the parties who are up for election and decide, who do I trust to be my ward councillor and represent me when such issues arise? So something that is very important to understand about electing a ward councillor is that it's winner takes all. And so no matter how much of the vote the ward councillor gets, whether it's 50% or 30%, if that councillor gets the most votes, they are elected and everybody else walks away with nothing. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, this doesn't exactly seem fair, because in South Africa, it's a proportional representation system where if, let's say, a party gets 33% of the vote, well, then they should get 33% of the seats, right? And that's where the PR ballot comes in. So when people vote on the PR ballot, that is the proportional list. That helps the IEC to realize how many seats need to be allocated to each party based on the percentage of the vote they get. And so what ends up happening is that the ward list results and the PR list results are brought together by the IEC, who oversees the election. And then what they end up doing is they add up all the tallies of votes that every party gets, and they allocate seats according to the percentage for each party. And that way they ensure that even though certain parties win the wards outright, they'll still only receive the proportion of the vote they actually got. So if, for example, the ANC wins 50% of the wards, even though they only got 25% of the votes, then what the PR list does is it makes things fair. And so other parties might receive more PR votes than what the ANC did, so that the ANC, sure, while winning 50% of the wards, will only end up with the exact percentage of seats in council that they would have earned due to the percent they got of the total votes. And so now that we've discussed this two-ballot system, I think we need to determine what we're actually voting for in local elections. It's really just two words: service delivery. In municipalities across South Africa, the job of the city council and its representatives is to ensure that residents receive the services that they deserve. This includes refuse removal, so picking up garbage on time so that it doesn't pile up. It includes filling potholes, ensuring that robots are working, making sure that there are no water leaks. If ever there is a power cut that's not load shedding related, they need to be speaking to the local power operator and ensure that this gets resolved. Same thing with water. And so when it comes to these political parties who talk about their grand agendas, foreign policy, economic direction of the country, and revolutions, as we've heard certain parties talk about, it's important that as voters, we do not listen to them. These are not issues that have anything to do with the municipal election. Yet, as we see in New York, many voters get carried away and treat them as such. And so rather than repeating the mistakes of New York City, let's ensure that we do better. Let's ensure that we understand the voting system for municipal elections. We know what we're voting for so that we can make the most informed decision possible on voting day. Thanks very much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.